Hello, my name is Professor Brandon Gillette. I am a professor of philosophy at MCC Blue River. You've seen a couple of these lectures delivered by Professor Doug Fischel, who is a professor of philosophy at MCC Maple Woods campus. Professor Fischel and I go way back. Actually, once upon a time, we shared an office in graduate school at the University of Kansas. Some of those lectures will be delivered by Professor Fischel. Some of them will be delivered by me. I'm the professor for this section, so we're going to be mixing some of those in. In this particular case, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about truth and validity, because I think that the textbook has not been quite as precise and has been a little bit briefer than I would otherwise prefer. There are two concepts that I would like to visit in this lecture, the concepts of truth and validity. Both are useful in evaluating arguments, and we'll be talking about truth and validity in the context of evaluating arguments. Chaffee starts with the concept of truth, and so we will also start there. Chaffee in section 1.4 writes, "How true are the supporting reasons? The first aspect of the argument you must evaluate is the truth of the reasons that are being used to support a conclusion." We'll see later that actually we're going to want to address validity first when we are evaluating an argument, but in explaining truth and validity, it does make some sense to start with explaining the concept of truth first, so let's do that. So let us begin with the concept of truth. This is a concept that I imagine you were looking forward to taking a look at in a philosophy course, perhaps spending a lot of time really digging in. What is the truth? I mean, it sounds like a very profound question. However, in the context of argument evaluation, it's actually a deceptively simple question. So in order to explain the meaning of truth, I'm going to provide you a series of examples. On the next number of slides, I've got some claims. So for example, on this one, the claim is the cat is on the mat, with the questions, what makes it true and what makes it false? So this is a claim, a statement, a sentence, however you want to put it. And the idea is that if you want to look at it and say, all right, what would make the claim a true one? What would make the claim a false one? And this is one of those questions that sometimes it can be so easy that it's hard. And so the correct answer here is that if the cat is on the mat, then the sentence is true. And if the cat is not on the mat, then the sentence is false. That's all it is. And believe it or not, that's all you need to know about the truth. That's really all there is to it. It's not actually any more complicated than that. But people like to try and make it more complicated, so we're going to try and see some of the false starts that people like to go on with respect to truth. So the takeaway from sentences of this kind, like the cat is on the mat, is that many statements are, as we say in philosophy, contingent. They're sometimes true and they're sometimes false, and that just depends on how the world is. And it's impossible to know whether those statements are true or false without some kind of, without going out and checking, right? You don't know whether the cat is on the mat, whether you have to look, see, where's the cat, where's the mat, is the cat on it? Without knowing, without looking into the world, you can't know whether that sentence is true or false. And mats move and cats move. Cats move on their own, mats can be moved. But the idea is that sometimes the cat is on the mat and sometimes it isn't. And when it is, that sentence is true, and when it isn't, it isn't. So don't think of the truth as something that's like timeless or, special or something like that. It's just that mundane. Consider this sentence next. There were an even number of chess games completed on Earth yesterday. Well, what a chess game is, right? And whatever number there was some number of chess games completed on Earth yesterday. Whatever number that was, it's either odd or it's even. So either this sentence is true or false, depending on what that number actually is. And you might say, well, but nobody knows that number, or it seems like perhaps even could know that number. And I agree. That's an important thing to keep in mind, is that a sentence like this one, it doesn't matter if anybody knows whether the sentence is true or false. It is either true or false. Consider now this sentence. I formulated this sentence specially to make it impossible for anybody to know whether the sentence is true or false. I've said there is a can of Dr. Pepper floating in space further away than any human will ever see. Well, if there is such a can, then the sentence is true. If there is not such a can, the sentence is false. That's the case. You know, we may have no good reasons for thinking that there is a can of Dr. Pepper, such a can. But of course, if it's further away than anyone will ever see, nobody will really know whether it is or isn't there. And so again, this is one of those. My point here is as follows: that the takeaway from this is that the truth is mind independent. All right, this is a very important concept to keep in mind. If there were no minds, that is, no thinking things, including human beings, there would still be truths, right? You don't require human beings to have truths or minds of any kind. So, for example, if there were no minds, then it would be true that there were no minds. Okay, at the very least, many other things would also be true. You don't have to have a mind in order for something to be true. So truth and belief are not the same thing. Thinking that something is the case and it's actually being the case are two different things. Truth and proof are also not the same thing. Just because somebody offers you a proof of some particular thing does not actually necessarily mean that that thing is true. Now, if the proof is a good one, it ought to mean that the thing is true, but it's not a foolproof connection. Truth and evidence are not the same thing. There are many good reasons to believe some things that turn out not to be true. Right? If you just sort of walk around, outside, you certainly don't feel like the Earth is moving. You know, like it's spinning on its axis and revolving around the sun. You don't feel like it is, and so that's at least a fairly good reason for thinking that it isn't. Unfortunately, that's not true. So again, truth and evidence are also not the same thing. So to further get a little bit of a wedge in there, the distinction between something's being true and it's being believed, just consider the following: that not everything that we believe is true, and not everything that is true is believed by anyone. What someone believes has no necessary connection to what is true. Things can be true even if nobody or everybody thinks so, and things can be false even if nobody or everybody thinks so. Right, these are all ways of just saying that the truth is mind independent. It's a very important thing to consider. The next couple of sentences are sort of fun. So consider this one: all triangles have three sides. Right? Think very carefully about this. Even pause the video for a second to think, what makes it true? What makes it false? Now consider this sentence: all bachelors are married. Think very carefully, again, pausing the video if necessary. What makes it true and what makes it false? Those two are kind of funny because they seem to be true or false by definition. The one about triangles was true by definition, right? By definition, all triangles have three sides. By definition, a bachelor is an unmarried man. And so the idea is that, both of those statements, one of them is, the first was true by definition, the second was false by definition. There are statements that are true or false by definition, that you don't actually have to look out into the world. All you have to do is understand what the words mean. Those statements, statements of this kind, the ones that are true or false by definition, are usually not very interesting. They're things like triangles have three sides, bachelors are unmarried, transparent things are things that you can see through, stuff like that's, it's again not super informative. Although sometimes statements like this are important, especially in the theories of mathematics and things like that. Now consider this one. Here's the sentences: the Mona Lisa is a beautiful painting. All right, consider what makes it true and what makes it false, and pause the video if you have to, just to really give it a good think. Okay, the reason this one's in here is to entice you to make a very particular kind of a mistake that I think we ought to correct here. So if you're like many people, especially in the United States, if you went to school, especially in the United States, like I did, you would have learned at some point a long time ago that there are facts and there are opinions, and that never the twain shall meet. Those are separate things. The worksheets have you put stuff into two different buckets, and every time you see something like, good, bad, better or worse, beautiful, ugly, fair, unfair, all of that stuff, all of that gets thrown into the opinion bucket, and you just say, oh, that's an opinion. It doesn't have to, it can't be true or false. And that's unfortunately a mistake. An opinion is another word for a belief. It's a thing that somebody thinks. A fact is another word for something that is true, right? Something that actually is the case. And some of our opinions are the case, right? Some of the things we think are actually true. Some of the things we think are not true, right? And so the idea that a fact and opinions cannot be the same thing is it's a mistake. Okay, your education has made a mistake in saying that those two things are mutually exclusive. Again, that would be really absurd. And I want to just give you a couple of counterexamples right quick. So if facts and opinions can't be the same thing, then that would mean that because Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States, that's a fact, that's a thing that's true. That means that I can't think that Lincoln was president. Well, that's absurd. I do think Lincoln was president. And conversely, if I do think Lincoln was president, well, because it's something that I think, that would make it an opinion. And if all opinions can't be facts, well, then that means if I think Lincoln was president, then he can't have actually been president. And that's absurd. So look, some of the things you think are true, undoubtedly. Many of the things you think are false, undoubtedly. It's just that it's hard to tell which is which. If you knew which of your beliefs were false, you would stop believing them. So they kind of hide, right? That's part of their problem. But yes, opinions can be true or false, just like everything else. And that includes evaluative claims about what is good, bad, fair, unfair. I mean, imagine walking up to the person that taught you this whole fact opinion thing and saying, when they told you, like, don't hit your classmates, you say, well, by your own logic, that's just like your opinion, and I can safely ignore it. You tell me it's wrong to hit my classmates or wrong to cheat on my schoolwork or, all those sorts of things. And things are undoubtedly actually good and bad, right? Blue is the best color for the water on a map, right? I mean, just like try and make a map some other way sometime and see how it goes for you. Blue is a bad color for desert camouflage, right? There you go. That's just true. Now, of course, there are controversial claims involving good, bad, better, best, fair, unfair. But again, remember, the truth is mind independent. Just because we don't agree what's actually true, well, something has to be, right? If somebody says, policy X is unfair, right? Well, either it is or it isn't. Oftentimes, sometimes it's complicated where a policy might be fair in some ways and unfair in others. That's just part of the world being messy. But all of those things are actually true or false, right? The things really are fair. The word means something. So don't put those things in some category where they can't be true or false. Otherwise, you're going to lose most of the most important things that you need to decide. Aren't you trying to live a good life? Aren't you trying to do things that are best for you and the people you care about? Isn't that good? And again, you'd have to just throw all of those things away if you want to treat if you want to keep that fact opinion thing. So just ditch it. Just ditch it. Keep in mind that claims are either true or false based on the way the world is. Okay. All right, here's one just to see if you're paying attention. So Biff thinks the Vikings will win the next Super Bowl, right? Yeah, that's never going to happen. But just look at the sentence as written, and what would make it true, what would make it false. All right, and if you said it's true if Biff thinks the Vikings will win the next Super Bowl, then you're right. Okay, the sentence is about what Biff thinks, right? That's what it says. It doesn't say anything about the Vikings, actually. And so it's false if Biff does not think the Vikings will win the next Super Bowl. Okay, that's, again, just there to make sure you're paying attention. All right, the second concept I wanted to talk a bit about is validity. So, take a breath, walk around the room a little bit, have a nice drink of water, make sure you're all hydrated and everything, because I went through the last thing a little bit quickly. I'm going to try and go through this one reasonably quickly as well. In the textbook, we've got this notion of something following from something else. And I don't know that anybody actually uses that phrase anymore. It's a very old-fashioned phrase, and I'm not sure it's very clear in the textbook what that actually means. Here's what Chaffee says in section 1.4. He says, in addition to determining whether the reasons are true, evaluating arguments involves investigating the relationship between the reasons and the conclusion. When the reasons support the conclusion so that the conclusion follows from the reasons being offered, the argument is considered to be a valid argument, right? So there's a couple things I dislike in here. One of them is this, again, use of follow from. I don't know that people know what that means. Also, this considered to be, you don't need that in there. So when the conclusion follows from the reasons, sometimes called premises, the argument just is valid, whether anybody considers it to be valid or not. That's an objective fact, validity. All right, so let's maybe, I don't want to necessarily say replace the definition. Really, I just want to get a little more precise about the definition. And so let's say this then about validity. Validity is a property of arguments. So in our context, we're going to say that a whole argument, right, the whole thing, including the reasons and the conclusion, or again, sometimes those reasons are called premises, the whole thing, the whole argument is either valid or it's invalid. Every argument is one of those two things, and it's never in the middle, it's never both, it's never neither, it's always one or the other. And only, like, again, whole arguments are this way. Statements, ideas, premises, conclusions, none of those things can be valid in this sense. One of the things that makes this confusing is that the word valid is a word that we use just on the street in everyday life. But in this context, when we're talking about evaluating arguments, it means a very specific thing that's not exactly like the way that we use the word valid, just, again, out in casual conversation. And so here's our definition. This is the one I want you to key in on. An argument is valid if it is rationally impossible for its conclusion to be false while all of its premises are true. Right? So that's the specific definition that I really want you to hone in on and think about as you go through this unit. An argument is valid if it is rationally impossible for its conclusion to be false while all of its premises are true. And I want you to note that that definition doesn't require any part of the argument, whether the reasons or the conclusion, to actually be true, right? If you're thinking to yourself, what? Read it carefully again, right? And we'll give you some examples. So here is a sample valid argument, right? I've labeled the reasons with P1 and P2. Again, the P is for premise. More commonly, when we talk about arguments, the reasons are called premises. In this textbook, he just uses the word reason. That's fine. It doesn't make any real difference. But that just so you know, that's what the P is for. It's for premise. And so the first couple of premises, the reasons here say all dogs are mammals and all mammals are animals, and that's why, conclusion, all dogs are animals, right? And if you say, well, that makes perfect sense, that's because it does. The argument is valid because it would be impossible for this conclusion to be false, right, while the premises were all true. So in a world where all dogs really are mammals and in a world where mammals are animals, it would be impossible for all dogs not to be animals, right? I mean, it just has to be. That's what, again, that's the sense of the conclusion follows from the reasons or the premises. So think of yourself trying to tell somebody, say, oh no, I believe that all dogs, I believe all dogs are animals and I believe that all mammals are animals. And so somebody says, well, then you must believe that all dogs are animals. And you're like, no. They'd think you'd lost your mind, and you would have, right? That's what makes an argument valid, is that if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be. But notice again that the definition of a valid argument does not require that any of those things actually be true. So as it turns out, this is a valid argument and its premises are true. Let me show you another kind. This argument is also a valid argument. The first premise is that all dogs are reptiles. The second premise is that all reptiles are Martians. And the conclusion is that all dogs are Martians. The reason that it's valid is because if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be. That is, that conclusion can't be false while those premises are true. There would be some kind of nonsense going on if that were the case. And so again, imagine telling somebody, I believe that all dogs are reptiles, and then tell them, I believe all reptiles are Martians. Then they would say something like, well, then you must believe that all dogs are Martians. And if you say, well, no, again, they would think you had lost your mind, and they'd be right. Because if you really did believe those premises, you really would have to believe that conclusion. And so it's a valid argument because if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be. Again, remember the definition of validity doesn't actually require any of these things to be true. All right, so review those last two examples until that really starts to sink in and start to make more sense, because that's the number one thing that people tend to have a really hard time with when they first learn validity. And it's not a problem if you have a hard time with certain things when you're first learning this stuff. That happens. What's a problem is if you just sort of don't learn it. That's a problem. Okay, so the takeaway from those two examples is that validity is actually about structure, not content. As your textbook author correctly says, validity is about the relationship between the premises and the conclusion, and not actually about whether any of those things are actually true or not. And so consider that any argument with the below structure would be valid even if its premises are not actually true. So this is the structure that both of the two previous arguments had, that the structure all A's are B's, premise 2, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's. Now notice, whatever you put in for A, B, and C, it's going to end up with a valid argument, even if the individual claims that you end up formulating that way are not true, like say all dogs are reptiles. That's not true, right? But if all dogs were reptiles and all reptiles are Martians, well, it would have to be true that all dogs were Martians. So that's what, again, validity is about structure, not about content. Truth is about content, not about structure. So let's take a look at the other kind of let's take a look at an invalid argument, one that does not have this very interesting property. So consider this argument. This is an argument where the reasons are, first, the Earth's moon is not made of cheese. Okay. Premise 2 is Charles Dickens wrote the novel Oliver Twist. Okay. Conclusion is George Orwell was the pen name of Eric Blair. Well, all right. I mean, some of those things you might already have known, some of those things you could look up to verify, but no, all of those claims are true, right? It's true that the Earth's moon is not made of cheese. It's true that Dickens wrote Oliver Twist, and it's true that George Orwell was the pen name of a guy named Eric Blair. All of those things are true. But notice that's not what makes an argument valid. Validity and truth are not the same thing. It's possible, notice, for the conclusion to be false, even if those premises were true. Right? Imagine, does what the moon is made of and who wrote Oliver Twist have does it force anything about George Orwell or Eric Blair to be the case or not the case? No. All right. Again, these are unconnected things, right? And they're very obviously unconnected. You're not going to see in reality any arguments that are this obviously invalid. Although you might write a few in a discussion assignment, but they won't be this bad. But the idea is it's not invalid because these things don't, quote, have something to do with each other. It's just because it's possible for the conclusion to be false even while the premises were true. Notice the fact that all these statements are true doesn't help it. Okay, and so again, the structure of the argument is invalid. And this is one of those things where, remember I said earlier that when you're evaluating an argument, you actually want to evaluate validity first and then truth, right? Because if you were to look at this one, spend all this time looking to see, to figure out whether these things were all true, right? Looking everything up, okay, everything's true, right? And then you go and look for, but it's invalid, right? Look at validity first, because if the argument's not valid, it doesn't matter if the premises are true or not, they're not going to grant you the conclusion. Right, the conclusion doesn't follow from them, so who cares if they're true or not? So yeah, do validity first, then worry about truth. So one of the things that the text does that I think is pretty pretty good, is that it gives you a small number of argument forms that you can sort of, that are the really common kinds of argument forms. You can fit lots of different arguments into these kinds of formats. And what this is a kind of shortcut. Of course, you can say so much more than we have about validity and about arguments and about especially deductive reasoning. In fact, there's an entire course at MCC and most other colleges. Here at MCC, it's Philosophy 200. It's called Logic. The entire course is about all the fascinating things that you can dive into with deductive reasoning, and it all starts with the concept of validity, and validity runs all the way through it, and it gets tremendously complex and fascinating. This is not a logic course. This is an intro to philosophy course. We need you to have just the basics here so that we can do a few things later. And so one way to get you those basics is to say, all right, look, let's just show you a few argument forms that you can then kind of see as patterns. And then if you can fit an argument into that kind of form, then you'll know it's valid. And if something doesn't quite fit into one of those forms, maybe not, right? So the three forms of argument that the text supplies to you are Modus Tollens, Modus Tollens, and the Disjunctive Syllogism. So let's take a quick look at some of those things, starting with this one. So consider the argument, if it is raining, then the ground is wet. Right? Reason 2 is it is raining. And conclusion is the ground is wet. And if that looks like almost too obvious to be interesting, well, again, that's the point of validity. Yeah, you want to make it this clear, because once you start dealing with philosophical arguments, that is arguments about really difficult concepts, the simpler you can make your argument, the better, because you're already dealing with complex and difficult material. So again, this argument's structure, its form, in other words, is as follows. It's if something, then something else, if R, then W, or then, and in the second premise, it asserts R, right, the if part, and then concludes W, the then part, right? That's the structure that is modus ponens. And notice whatever we put in there is going to give us like valid reasoning, right? If acorn squash, then R2D2, acorn squash, well, therefore R2D2. I mean, it works no matter what's in there. And so consider the following, right? This is another kind of, this is the way in which validity is kind of like a magic trick, right? So imagine that the road ahead splits into a left fork and a right fork. I'm reminded of a quote from a famous baseball player named Yogi Berra, who once said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. So that's what I always think of when I do this example. Anyway, the road ahead splits into a left fork and a right fork. One of the forks will take me to Boston. The left fork will not take me to Boston. I bet you all of you are thinking the exact same thing, right? And it's because you're capable of doing basic logic. That's what this is. And it's like a magic trick for making you think something that's not actually stated here. You have no choice but to conclude that that right fork will take you to Boston. That's the thing that follows from these premises, from these reasons, right? And it follows it because it has this sort of valid structure going. The structure is called a disjunctive syllogism. It's a very fancy word. Most people anymore just call it the process of elimination, because that's what it is. If you say, look, there are two options, and one of them isn't it, therefore it's got to be the other one. So you say A or B, not A, therefore B. That's the structure of disjunctive syllogism. Anything you put in place of A and B in terms of like complete, sentences, that'll work. That'll make you a valid argument. The last one is an argument called Modus Tollens. So consider this one. If the moon were made of cheese, astronauts could eat it. Premise 2 is astronauts cannot eat the moon. Therefore, the moon is not made of cheese. Right? Again, if that sounds pretty reasonable, that's because it is. So again, the structure of this one is a little bit like modus ponens, but it's not. This one starts with a conditional, if P then Q, the if then statement. It denies the second part, the consequent, is what we call this, the then part of the conditional, and then it concludes with the negation of the if part. All right. And so again, keep in mind these capital letters stand for whole claims, like things where something is said about something. like the moon is made of cheese, or astronauts can't eat the moon, etc. One of the things you want to make sure of is that you don't commit one of Modus Tollens or Modus Tollens's cousins that are mistakes. They're invalid argument forms known as affirming the consequent or denying the antecedent. So the tricky thing about this is that some of these things they sound just fine when they go by fast enough, and then but they don't quite make sense. They don't quite work. So consider this one. Consider affirming the consequent, which is what happens when you say premise one, right? If it is raining, then the ground is wet. The ground is wet, therefore it is raining. And again, when that goes by fast enough, it sounds just fine. But consider that its structure is not modus ponens. Remember, modus ponens is if A then B, A therefore B. This one is if A then B, B therefore A. So it sort of gets it backward a little bit. And look at the ordinary language here. You can see what the trouble is, right? Just, you might say, well, look, imagine it's true that if it is raining, then the ground is wet. And it could also be true that the ground is wet, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's raining, right? There could have been a water balloon fight, could have been a sprinkler on. I mean, it's all sorts of things that could have accounted for having true premises and still a false conclusion. So it's possible that this conclusion is false even if these premises are both true. That's what makes the argument invalid. And so literally anything in this kind of a form is invalid, whereas if it was in the proper form of modus ponens, it would have been valid. So consider denying the antecedent, again, the sort of weird cousin of Modus Tollens. So if you take a look at those reasons again, the first premise says, if the moon were made of cheese, astronauts could eat it. Second premise is the moon is not made of cheese, therefore astronauts can't eat the moon, right? And again, that sounds just fine when it goes by fast enough, but take a little bit of time to look at it more closely and think about it, because this structure that this argument has is not a valid structure. It's not modus tollens. It's denying the antecedent. So think, all right, if the moon's made of cheese, astronauts could eat it, right? Imagine that's true. Now imagine it's true that the moon is not made of cheese. Okay, great. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not made of something else edible, right? Maybe it's made of cotton candy. Maybe it's, blancmange or something like that, whatever. So that's, again, you can think of a way in which the conclusion could be false, even if the premises were true, and that's what makes this format invalid. So that's all the things you want to try and keep an eye on. If you have questions about any of this, please contact me, your instructor. Because I do know that sometimes validity can get a little tricky. That's why I wanted to give you a little bit more detail than we have just in the printed form of the text.